So, hello, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is that you're located, and a very warm welcome to this FinGeo webinar, which is it's an honor to chair and host in the absence of the wonderful Sabine Dory, who is currently in Singapore and probably asleep. So I'm Maedhbh Lochlainn. I'm a postdoc in the University of Luxembourg, where Thomas is currently located, but I am not because I'm in Dublin at the minute. This term's webinar series is co-chaired by Sabine and Manuel, I believe. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces and new faces participating. So it's, of course, a particular pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you, who I have the pleasure of working with in Luxembourg. So today we are joined by Thomas Sigler. Thomas is an associate professor of human geography at the University of Queensland in Brisbane in Australia, and guest professor of geography at the University of Luxembourg, where I have the pleasure to work with Thomas. So Thomas's research interests sit at the intersection of urban and economic geography, with a strong focus on how cities are shaped by globalization. He's published widely across geography and urban planning, and he sits on the editorial boards of Urban Geography, Geographical Research, and Global Network. And Thomas is also the FinGeo Regional Ambassador to Australia, an esteemed position, and we work together on an FNR-funded project called FinCity in the University of Luxembourg. So before I hand the mic over to you, Thomas, just two quick kind of housekeeping rules. I'd ask that you keep your microphone muted until we get to the question and answer session. When, of course, you should feel free to raise your hand, unmute, and to ask a question. You can also use the chat box to indicate a question throughout the session, and I'll kind of keep an eye on that there. Either if you'd like to chime in to ask your question yourself, or you'd like to phrase it in the chat, and we can read it out. So with that said, we'll start with Thomas's presentation, which is on dependency, geography, or development, what explains the global financial networks of cities. So Thomas, will hand over to you for the first 35 minutes or so. I'll give you a time sign with kind of 10 minutes to go and 5 minutes to go. And if you continue, then I will indicate my distress on camera so that we can bring the talk to an end in time to have some questions and discussion. So without further ado, over to you, Thomas, and thank you very much for joining.
Thanks. I was going to say, under normal circumstances, you could come over to my office with a squirt gun. But of course you're in Dublin, so the squirt gun is the indicator that you're out of time.
Metaphorically, if you see me doing this, well then next time I see you, that will be what will happen. So.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be doing this. I actually ran the FinGeo seminar series a few years back, and I thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice to actually present my own research at some point. So I pretty much know everyone or most people on the call, so I guess we'll keep it a little bit less formal than I would if I had, say, a couple hundred people. So at any point, feel free to interrupt me if you have a question about the material. So this presentation is kind of a summative presentation, so it's a little bit different than, I guess, one that's based on a single study or a single case study. It kind of represents the culmination of what I would call a long and interesting project on global city networks that I've worked over the years with Kirsten Martinez, Ben de Rutter, Jacopo Jacopini, Glenn Searle, Matthew Taunts. It's a supporting cast of about Julia Loganova. It's a supporting cast of about 6 or 7. So, and it actually reflects 2 or 3 different papers. So I'm actually doing something you probably shouldn't do, which is merging papers. And I'll actually do something even worse, which is switch back and forth between them without telling you. But the point is, I just sort of want to summarize what I've been working on, partly because I think it's more interesting than presenting a single paper, and partly because I'm sort of transitioning away from it. So I've sort of done my time with global city networks. I'm still interested in it, but our funding is up, which means we no longer have formal support for the project. And it turns out not a lot of PhD students are interested in global city networks. So I don't actually currently have any PhD students working on this project. So I wouldn't say it's a thing of the past, but I would say for now I'm sort of phasing out of it. And some of the more interesting aspects of this project. So the original idea was to focus specifically on global city networks from the perspective of energy and resources, given that we are usually in Australia and energy and resources are what makes the country tick economically. But I've sort of adapted this a little bit to look more at financial networks. But I guess the punchline, at least, is that all networks are financial, especially when you're looking at securities, which is exactly what I'm looking at. So I'll share my screen just to kick things off. Cool. So as Maeve mentioned, I am normally based at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, the host of the 22-32 Summer Games. Probably the only reason you would have heard of it aside from UQ. And also a guest professor here in Luxembourg, where I'm currently working with Maeve and some others on a financial geographies project tied to commercial property in 3 European financial centers. And it's been a very interesting month here in Luxembourg. So as you all know, urban economic geography was very much focused on place and on citing and on locating things and what we might call sort of old school economic geography. So in the terminology of Manuel Castells, of course, these are the places of spaces. We were interested in locating everything from factories to natural endowments to sort of Cristaller's work on the distribution of cities and economic activities and city sizes and things like that. And as you also know, over the course of the 20th century, we gradually migrated toward a geography of flows. And so flows being critical to most urban and economic processes, most financial processes. Those flows were captured different ways in the literature. Of course, on the top, we've got the work tied to the World Cities or Global Cities Networks crew, and very much influential, at least in my work, in terms of conceptualizing the global economy, but also national economies, also economic sectors from a networks perspective. So just sort of giving you a little bit of grounding in terms of the network-based aspect of that. But I guess the first point I want to make is that networks aren't new. There have been networks as long as there have been cities. These networks weren't explicitly financial, but they were partly financial. So, the top left, you have the Silk Route or the Silk Road across Central Asia. On the top right and sort of bottom right, you've got the Hanseatic League. So dating back to the 14th century, you have seaborne and land-based trade feeding into Northern Europe and the Baltic. And really, but not just a collection of cities and towns, but genuinely a network. These were actual networks. They were trade networks primarily, and the idea was that economies of scale through trade could be achieved, and so city specializations were developed in large part based on the natural endowments of the respective parts of the region, and of course the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean routes that followed in medieval times on the left. And again, certainly a network. I mean, the Roman Empire itself was a network. It was a loose confederation of cities that spanned up as far as I guess Hadrian's Wall and as far south as North Africa. But really, at heart, it was a network. There was an economic geography to it, but there was also a central node in Rome. So networks have been around a long time. In fact, Peter Taylor, I don't know who he did this with, but actually did a network geography of Mesopotamia. So dating back to the first urban civilization, and actually gave Babylon and Uruk and Ur a global city network connectivity, just like we're all familiar with in the case of London and New York and Tokyo. So we can see that this is not, this concept of networking is not new, and that cities have been networked for a long time. So you can see that certain cities are more networked than others, and I'll explain this for those of you perhaps less familiar with this concept. So the bigger bubbles are those that are perceived to be more important. Generally, that importance is calculated through one of several measures, but typically something called centrality. The centrality is a formal measure in network theory and network science that relates to the number of connections. Now, it could be first order connections, or second order connections or some other form, direct or indirect connections. And typically, and this is not the case, if you see a network graph like the one on the bottom right, typically the colors indicate communities. So there's a partitioning algorithm. Some of them are pretty simple, some of them are more sophisticated, that draw a line between what we call groupings of nodes, so the nodes of the circles, and then the colors are assigned based on the community it falls into, and it gets quite complicated from there. But in basic terms, the bigger the bubble, the more important the city, and the bigger the bubble, typically, or the more centrally located within the network graph, the more important the city. So we can understand things about the important cities. We can understand things about the less important cities, which we might refer to as peripheral cities. But we can also understand things about the whole network itself, and of course, change over time. Now, as we know, and this is not my graphic, but as we know, global flows are increasingly financial flows. And that's because trade itself isn't as interesting as it used to be. I think counting the amount of coal shipments and the amount of computer shipments and cars and sort of manufacturing related commerce is perhaps not as interesting to economic geographers and financial geographers as it once was. I think we take for granted a lot of the global commodity chain and global value chain perspectives. And we now really, I think it's the financial geography perspective really adds a lot in terms of conceptualizing these flows, in terms of the various vectors of money. This is, of course, not the only conceptualization of that, but as we know, multinational corporations are the large actors in determining cross-border flows, but we also have lots of other cross-border flows of financial resources, ranging from remittances to labor and migration to various capital flows in terms of aid or development assistance. So a number of key processes in financialization underpin these networks that I'm looking at. So the first one is that cross-border transactions now are not necessarily genuine transactions. So cross-border transactions are necessary. Money needs to flow across borders to make the world economy happen, so to speak. But at the same time, we've realized, as we, being researchers, have realized that the structures are not necessarily straightforward. So if China buys something, someone in China buys something from someone in America, the financial flow corresponding to that won't necessarily mirror a single transaction from China to the United States. As we all know, there are a network of banks, there are a network of financial actors, and that particular transaction might cross several borders and change hands several times for several reasons. But first and foremost, what we do observe in the global network of cities, and this is not something I'll talk about today in great detail, is that oftentimes these structures optimize tax rather than reflecting genuine activity. There's been widespread banking deregulation, so there's just more global capital in general. The growth of the funds industry, both in terms of sort of what I would call the conventional funds industry, mutual funds, exchange traded funds, investment banks, and so on, but also newer increasing pools of money like sovereign wealth funds exert more pressure on global activities. So money is changing hands across borders with greater speed and greater volume than ever. You also have geopolitics playing into cross-border flows. You've got global trade blocs, which to some degree reinforce existing relationships and also create new relationships. So I guess the best example there is China's Belt and Road Project. So most of you, if not all of you, would be familiar with China's Belt and Road Project. But the idea is that it creates very specific economic relationships and financial relationships based on geopolitics, particularly Chinese geopolitics. And the European Union is another one. So there are lots of these trade blocs or customs unions or other types of supranational organizations or supranational projects that in fact determine financial flows and commercial flows, perhaps more than they would in a completely liberalized situation. Fifth and finally, we have an observation that I've made for a long time, which I can't necessarily substantiate, but I think we would all widely recognize that firms in general, so all firms, multinational firms included, increasingly resemble financial actors in their operations and decision making. And I guess this is a key point. So the reason that the widget corporation exists is no longer to sell widgets, right? The reason the widget corporation exists is to make money, whether that involves selling widgets or not. In fact, it might not sell widgets at all. It might subcontract the production of widgets. or it might just sell the intellectual property around the widget itself. And that's exactly how some of these newer players like Uber and Airbnb have structured themselves. All they really do is sell intellectual property through a financialized remittance vehicle, and they ultimately don't produce widgets. They don't even own the widgets or the assets. They simply control them, and they control the IP around them. So almost all firms, doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether it's heavy manufacturing or biotech or IT, increasingly resemble financial firms. There's also a financial element to it. A lot of them are pretty heavily indebted and also highly tied to financial circuits. So the whims of their banks and the whims of the banking and financial resources that support them often translate into business decisions, possibly more so than they may have before. So in terms of this research project, we're interested in understanding how and why financial and commercial relationships are maintained. So what is driving those relationships? And specifically, we use cities as the point of reference. So we use cities as the geographical scale, but I want to know why two cities are connected through financial flows, right? And I'll tell you in a minute how exactly we operationalize that. So in terms of the method,
Thomas, do you allow a question already?
Yes, I can. I think that's Michael, because I can
Yeah,
hear
exactly.
you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Michael here. Yes.
Yep.
So the when we are talking today about that globalization might be reversing, what is the factor that kind of reverses now, and would that factor be on your list? That also one of the factors does reverse, or is your list not complete in that sense? Like if you have some sort of political.
I mean, I guess that's what I was sort of referring to with the regionalization comment. That I personally don't see globalization as reversing. I simply see it as regionalizing more. Because I don't think cross-border activity is going away. I just think it's taking a new form, and I think there's going to be a regionalization. But yeah, maybe we can address some of that at the end if you don't mind. So in terms of our data, we have a data set that you may or may not be familiar with called Osiris. It's a commercial product most universities subscribe to, or many universities subscribe to, from a Dutch company called Bureau van Dijk. We downloaded all the firms and subsidiaries in the world. So that's every single listed company from 208 securities exchanges. The biggest ones, of course, being New York and Tokyo and London, and the smaller ones being places like Serbia and Ethiopia. And there are lots of countries have stock exchanges with just a handful of securities. 90,000 total firms, 1.3 million subsidiaries. So the average firm has somewhere around 15 subsidiaries. It's not every firm in the world, and it doesn't include private ones, so untraded firms, but it's the best we could do, and it's a pretty big number. So that's what the raw data looks like. It's pretty. The other reason we really like this data set is it's really clean. It's really well procured. It's updated often, so Bureau van Dijk does constantly update it, and also the geographies in the sectors are, I wouldn't say perfect, but they're very clean. So there's really good clarity around sort of 2-digit industrial codes, 4-digit industrial codes. So we can really drill down with this data. And it's also geocoded. So, or maybe I geocoded it, but it tells you what the address is, and then we geocoded it. All right, so why do we choose firms? Geography or Economic Geography 101. Firms are the building blocks of the global economy, and that multinational firms in particular, wield considerable power in cross-border transactions. Now, firms are important, but what's more important for this study are subsidiaries. So subsidiaries can take lots of different forms. As you can see on the right, a company like FedEx would have many subsidiaries. These are just examples of 6. There are a bunch of different reasons why a company would have subsidiaries. So first of all, to limit their liability. So if you sue FedEx Ground, FedEx Corporation won't go under. So it limits the indemnity that the parent corporation has. It can also wind it up pretty quickly if something happens. 2, in terms of regulation. So for example, a large multinational company might need a local license to operate. So Coca-Cola might create Coca-Cola Germany, Coca-Cola Luxembourg, and so on. These conform to national regulations and rules, so things like labor laws, but also foreign ownership rules. So oftentimes they're done as joint ventures. And then third, which I've mentioned, taxation. So Oftentimes we find subsidiaries are merely what we call shell corporations, and they're used to shift profits from high tax jurisdictions to low or no tax jurisdictions, which is exactly what some of our friends in Luxembourg do. And Luxembourg is a very low tax jurisdiction. And so as a result, there are lots of European headquarters of Amazon and Microsoft here, which are really subsidiaries of the parent company based in Seattle or wherever. So in terms of the firm subsidiary approach, we see this as a network because there's a genuine network link between the firm and the subsidiary. There's a two-way relationship between these two entities. And as a geographer, the reason I like this is because each of those two entities are in a place. So a firm or a headquarters is in a specific place, and a subsidiary is also in a specific place. Now, often you find firms and subsidiaries in the same city. So in New York, you might have a firm and lots of subsidiaries, but you also have subsidiaries in other cities or other places. So from the firm to the subsidiary, you have human and financial capital, intellectual capital being transferred. What the subsidiary typically returns is two things: financial capital, so profits, and market access or information. So oftentimes a subsidiary has a preferential view on a local market. So Coca-Cola Germany would play to the interests of German consumers and know the German market and regulations and allow Coca-Cola parent company to access that market. So here's the data we're working with. So you can see the New York Stock Exchange is the largest and the smallest stock exchanges. This is the top 30 or so. The smallest stock exchanges, as I said, just have a handful of listed securities. So we then reduced that to only the companies performing cross-border activities. So that worked out to roughly 40,000 companies with 163,000 subsidiaries and reporting to 13,000 headquarters across 3,000 cities in 187 countries. So still a pretty global network, even though we reduced it only to cross-border activity. We then created a firm subsidiary network using firms as their nodes. So in this case, cities become the nodes. So if Coca-Cola is located in Atlanta, then Atlanta becomes the node. And then we have the ties become inter-organizational relationships between the firms and their subsidiaries. So if Coca-Cola Germany is located in Frankfurt, the tie becomes between Atlanta and Frankfurt rather than between firm A and firm B. What are the key mechanisms? So we're looking for a couple different processes at work here. One is assortativity, which determines the sort of compatibilities and complementarities between actors and their attributes. And you'll see when I show you the actual data we used, what I mean by that. We also have relational embeddedness. So this influences the network position of labor, network position and relations of an actor. So it includes things like trust, introductions, knowledge, and so on. And the third and final one is proximity. So proximity can be interpreted many ways. In fact, there's an entire school of proximity I learned in doing my literature review. But proximity is gained through social organization of interactions, and it can mean typically it's not geographical proximity. So it can mean geographical proximity, but it can also mean things like social proximity or cognitive proximity. All right, so here's the fun part, the actual data. So you can see that the global city network of firms is very global. So you can see it resembles probably where you would expect it to be located, heavily concentrated in the Northern Hemisphere, but also a good number of firms throughout the Global South as well. Here's how the firm subsidiary looks like from a network perspective. So when we turn a map, that's just a series of dots, into a network, typically we have a firm structured with its subsidiaries. And where we get that intralock, so where we get the network itself, is that the firm of one company is located in the same city as a subsidiary of another company. Now, we don't know that they're related, and this is typically the biggest critique of this sort of work. We actually have no evidence that firm A and subsidiary B are in any way related. But by virtue of being in the same city, you can assume that some of the same processes were at work. So some of the same tax strategies, some of the same labor strategies, some of the same access strategies to optimize labor force and things like that. So it creates that interlock. Now here's where the node, so in this case, there would be a well-connected node in the middle. Let's call firm A located in Sydney. They're interlocking in Brisbane. The Brisbane firm then has a subsidiary in Port Moresby. Another firm has a subsidiary in Singapore and another in Tamworth, which is a smaller Australian city. This is a very typical geography. So this is what we observe over and over again, where there is an international component to the network. Sometimes it's directly through a major global city, or sometimes it's through a city that's more specialized. For example, Brisbane has a very close relationship with Papua New Guinea, which is where Port Moresby is. You also have sort of a tax haven geography. So if you notice, the names changed and the arrows changed. And this is what we observe with some companies that are more tax optimized. You'll see Bermuda coming up a lot, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. You'll see Cayman Islands and places like that coming up. And the reason they do that is so they can sell their intellectual property at arm's length. So there's a couple different processes happening, but typically this is how the network's structured, and we turn that raw data into a network. So that's what the big city network looks like. You can see there's quite a bit of coreness and peripherality. You can see all the cities at the edge are the ones that are relatively poorly connected. The ones in the middle are the ones that are relatively well connected. The colors represent countries. Here you can see what the core of the network looks like. So this is actually using a filter, a backbone filter, to reduce the network to sort of core, semi-periphery, which is the pink, and periphery, which is the gray. And you can see it's the usual suspects that come up in the network. Of course, this is just a particular network. It may look different in others. So if we look at all the interactions between all the cities, it's quite a global geography. It differs, of course, by which country. So some countries have many well-connected networks, actors, and this is from paper A, I'll call it. This is in global networks. For example, you can see in Sydney, in Australia, Sydney is much better connected than every other city. Same with Toronto in Canada, same with Paris in France. But other countries, for example, have multiple well-connected nodes. For example, in Spain, you've got Madrid and Barcelona, or in Germany, you've got Munich and Frankfurt. All right, so different countries, this is kind of just for showing you this just kind of for fun and comparison's sake. This is from paper A, which is less relevant to today's talk. You can see how this plays out from sort of a national perspective. So these are the cities in the Australian context that connect outward. The Indonesian context, sort of all roads lead to Jakarta. In the US context, you have lots of connections because you have lots of cities. In the Brazilian context, Sao Paulo is the big one, but of course you have connections to cities like Rio and Recife as well. All right, so that was just a bit of fun visualization. Back to the serious stuff, which is using what we call an exponential random graph model, or ERGM. I'm not going to pretend to be a methods expert. I've got people that are much better at these things than I am, who did the heavy lifting for me in R, but I do understand the basics. It's essentially analogous to logistic regression. Right? So you're trying to explain the existence of a tie, or a tie strength. So is there a connection between Atlanta and Frankfurt? Right now, it's very likely that there's a connection between Atlanta and Frankfurt. But then what explains that connection, and what explains all the connections that are like Atlanta and Frankfurt? So it predicts the probability of a tie being present, quantified on a scale of 1 to 0. And we tested for 5 different theories. So, and there's the formula in case you're interested. So theory 1 is that world region makes a difference. And this is the regionality question that Michael asked about. To what degree do firms interact with subsidiaries within their own region, or does it not matter? Hypothesis or data point 2, to what degree does language determine the degree to which cities interact with one another? Number 3, to what degree does primary industry determine the degree to which cities interact with each other? So, for example, cities that are in which more than half the firms are in one particular industry. So the example here on the chart is Linz, Austria, and Chicago. Both of them are manufacturing cities. So in this case, we considered it a homophilous relationship. It's a relationship that may be determined by industrial specialization. We wanted to know, to what degree does income group determine ties? So do cities in rich countries tie to other cities in rich countries, or do cities in rich countries tie to cities in less developed countries? So is it a core periphery relationship, or is it a periphery core relationship? And then 5th and finally, we wanted to know, this is more along the lines of homophily and the sort of birds of a feather concept. Do big cities or global cities just connect to one another? So is London overwhelmingly connecting to New York? Or is London only connecting to New York because they're both big cities? And actually, London's connections to New York are relatively weak compared to what we would expect to find. We did this assuming we were dealing with what we call a multiplex network. So a multiplex network is a network theoretical concept indicating that you have different things going on. So if you think of a friendship network, you may be somebody's colleague. You may also be their friend. You may also be their relative. You may also commute together. So there may be multiple relationships that determines your relationship with that other person. And in this case, we saw the relationship between various variables as part of the multiplex. So if New York and London are both global cities, but they're also both English-speaking cities. So in this case, we saw that as a multiplex relationship where different variables can be stacked and amalgamated. This is where I sort of, that's where my theoretical knowledge sort of ends, and it gets quite mathematical at that point. And I think we had a pretty strong debate with the author, with the editor herself about whether this was or wasn't a multiplex network. And I think that the terminology depended on whether we called it a multi-layer network or a multiplex network, and there is a subtle difference. So this is what the 5 different networks look like, hence the title of my talk, development, etc. You'll see the terms homophily and heterophily, which may sound confusing, but they really, homophily just means 2 like things are together, and heterophily means the opposite. So you have a like and an unlike thing together. So for example, the heterophily network with command and control means you have a less well-connected node and a more connected node that like each other. In terms of development, you would have a city in a less developed country and a city in a more developed country that like each other, or that are connected, I guess. So each of these reflects either a heterophilous relationship or a homophilous relationship, depending on whichever made sense. These are the top 30 cities in terms of their connections overseas. So you'll see the firm relationships within each of these cities is quite different. A lot of it is determined by the fact that English is a pretty strong language. So you'll see all the English speaking ones have lots of green. So Melbourne, Washington, London, and so on. Some cities are determined overwhelmingly by industry. So you can see, for example, Taipei has a lot of connections that are primarily industry driven, but also quite a few that are linguistic. You've got a number of relationships. This is a chart showing. Sorry. Sorry, the cleaning staff have just come to my my office. Apologies for that. So you've got a bar chart here showing a number of cities, or a number of relationships determined by each type. Relationship. The reason for that is quite simple. New York and London have lots of ties. So 24,000 of the total ties out of about 40,000 are determined by command. Out of about 100,000 are determined by commanded alone. You've then got an example here of 2 cities that have quite different profiles. So in one case, you've got San Jose. So San Jose's ties, you can see, are in large part determined by industry. So you can see they're a little bit purple, but also quite a bit red. So the command and control relationship, so connecting to more well-connected nodes. In the case of Taipei, you can see it's quite different, in fact. So San Jose is basically Silicon Valley. In the case of San Jose, for example, you can see a lot of linguistic ties. So presumably to places like Hong Kong, not so much mainland China in the case of Taipei, but also lots of purple ties, which indicates strong industrial and command and control geographies. So sort of conclude, I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll just wrap it up. This is the final table showing the results. You would interpret this table like you would the results of any sort of regression analysis. So the higher the number, the higher the coefficient, and the more stars, the better in terms of I've lost the word, but yeah, it's significance, sorry, in terms of significance. So you've got statistical significance indicated by 3 stars. That means the p-value is less than 0.01. So you interpret it just like a regression chart. So you can see, for example, where you've got a lot of significance is around levels of development. So, and especially the levels of development around lower developed cities. What that's saying is that less developed cities need those connections. And so where the relationship is between two cities in the network that are both poorly connected, that there's a high likelihood of being a tie, or higher than as if selected at random. And the same with lower to higher development cities. You can actually see the relationship with linguistic or language is negative, meaning cities are actually less likely to be connected if they speak the same language compared to a random network. And cities are significantly more likely to be connected if they are in the same industry. You can see that by a positive and significant coefficient under sort of industrial homophily. So what are the conclusions? The ERGM does actually do a pretty good job at predicting tie formation. Industry and reciprocity have strong positive effects. So reciprocity, just so yes, you can see industry is also positive as well. And reciprocity, sorry, where is it? It's about fifth from the bottom. Reciprocity, if you look in the far right column, where it says 2.5, that means if I send you a tie, you send me a tie back. So if Coca-Cola has an Atlanta-based company that has a Frankfurt subsidiary, it's very likely that some company in Frankfurt also has a subsidiary in Atlanta. So reciprocity is important, which means that we sort of see that reinforcement of city ties through path dependency. So less developed nodes need more connected nodes and more than vice versa. So that's saying, Tunis needs London more than London needs Tunis. In the sense of this network, and that connectivity from a network perspective, connectivity from Tunis or Algiers to London is a lot more beneficial for the former city than the latter city. Neither language nor region, interestingly enough, explain connectivity. So we didn't find a high significance or a high coefficient in either of those cases. But you can see that there was a command and control geography, a relatively low significance, but nonetheless, the coefficient was positive. So what that's saying is that poorly connected cities still do rely on it's very important for poorly connected cities to have ties to highly connected cities. And as I said, there's the finding around reciprocity. So reciprocity, again, it is if a tie is sent from city A to city B, it's likely that it will be reciprocated in a tie from city B to city A. So what are the implications, just to conclude, for financial geographies? Path dependence and historical ties are important to connectivity. So we do see that cities that are likely to be connected to one another, for example, cities between Europe and the US, or cities between Europe and Africa have perhaps stronger ties, and maybe not so much regional ties. We still find that global cities, these sort of usual suspects of global cities are important, and that they play a brokering function with peripheral regions and poorly connected cities, which highly depend on them. So in terms of financial networks, I would interpret this to mean London's financial complex and New York's financial complex still are important. Right? They may not be as important as they once were. Finance is more diffused. There's different types of finance. There's new financial centers. But at the end of the day, the connectivity that these large global cities provide is still critical for the overall network. And that financial links are strongly tied to an industrial and commercial connectivity. And for me, that was the most interesting finding, I guess, which is that it wasn't purely about these sort of cultural connections. That industry does matter, and you found quite a few cities. I'll give you some discrete examples. Brisbane, my city, is heavily tied to other coal-producing cities. So you find lots of firm subsidiaries in places like Inner Mongolia in China, Mongolia, coal-producing regions of other countries like South Africa, because Brisbane's primary industry is coal and coal extraction. And as a result, Queensland-based firms and firms from other cities will have subsidiaries in Brisbane. And you'll find that's true with heavy industry, you'll find it's true with energy, and especially true with finance. All right, that's all I have for today. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Thomas. That was brilliant. And I could have easily listened to you go on in much more nitty-gritty detail, and really, really interesting findings and stuff. I look forward to unpicking the papers. I'd open up the floor if anyone has any kind of burning questions that stand immediately for Thomas.
I mean, I could ask something. So if I may, so the main ties that you were talking about were these between subsidiary and headquarters.
Yep.
This is what we're, so I don't really see the connection to financial geography, other than assuming that there are ties between them. But so couldn't there be like flows? I mean, in a way, isn't it that financial geography doesn't need to have these ties, and I could send money easily from Frankfurt to New York without any, I mean, without being directly commuting banks?
Yeah, I guess maybe I could have made that point a little clearer. So I guess the point is these are only financial ties. So this is a firm subsidiary network that's located. These are securitized companies. These are companies that have a discrete location, but this financial structure is purely determined on the paper financial structure. There's no guarantee that anything changes hands between these firms, especially not trade. So these ties wouldn't exist if it weren't for finance, because that's how corporations are structured today. So in a way, this is a financial network rather than, say, a commercial network or a trade network or an informational network. So maybe I didn't stress that, but I guess in the network, I mean, this is based on the world's listing of stocks, listed securities.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Thanks for that clarification, Thomas. I see Fabio, you have your hand raised if you'd like to join in.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you, Thomas, for your presentation. All the data and the interpretation are very interesting. But I would have only one comment to make. It's not a doubt, and it's related to a term that you used in your title, the notion of dependency, which caused me great expectation. It was clear that you used the term from the path dependency theory, but there is a vast literature on the subject of dependency produced mainly, not only, but significantly by Latin American intellectuals. Perhaps it would be interesting at some point to compare or contrast your interpretations with these contributions. And thank you again for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to clarify, I think I actually did mean dependency in that sense. I'm just not sure we had many results to present. So when I said dependency, I guess what we mean is the relationship between a node in either a less well-connected city or a less well-developed country. That's the dependency relationship. And so, as I mentioned, a small city in Brazil as it would probably be more reliant on a big city in the global north or a big city in Brazil than vice versa. And I guess the question is, what's determining that relationship? Are they simply connected because there's a cultural connection because they both speak Portuguese? Are they connected because there's a historical connection, former colonization or something like that? Or is it purely a transactional relationship where one provides finance or advice to another? And again, the punchline of our research, at least, which is, it's a very big end study, so it doesn't say much about specific places, is that these relationships are primarily determined by very practical things. So industry and things like connectivity, rather than, say, culture or language or region. But yeah, no, I take your point, and I probably could explore the dependency aspect a bit further.
Cool. While other people have time to think of how to formulate their questions, I might just abuse my privilege as chair and slip in, not to raise or risk re-traumatization in discussion of the peer review process. But I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more, Thomas, maybe about that distinction and kind of like the difference between the multi-layering and other types of multiplicity within the network. That kind of distinction, if you wanted to unpick that.
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I think it's beyond my knowledge of network science. I mean, at that point, I was lost in the conversation of whether it was a multiplex or a multi-layer network.
Okay.
My interpretation of the conversation was that it was a matter of semantics. The editor saw it differently, and I let my network scientist colleague argue that one for us. So there is, and the reason I think is important is to go into the detail. we used a particular R package that was very new, and it was built around this concept of multi-layer. And I guess as you know, with any code, there's some inbuilt assumptions in the code that we sort of had to unpack in textual form.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's really interesting, kind of like collaborative project here of like critical quantity and also kind of trying to make sense of that information itself. I wondered also in terms of that kind of the question of kind of the level of development and kind of the connectivity between cities in contexts where you kind of make the argument that for, say, less developed cities, the connectivity is more important. Do you see different types of connectivity in areas that are kind of like less developed within the network? Does the industry matter in that context?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long answer and a short answer.
You have total time and free will to give the long answer.
Part of the answer relates to the ERGM itself. So the ERGM is a really heavy, like CPU intensive function. Like it takes a whole night to run. So you can't overload it. So that's why we had to reduce the network to the smallest possible network. And that's actually, in terms of our input variables, we had to treat it like a logistic regression. So we could only really have categorical variables. If we did anything else that, like, obviously there's not just developed countries and undeveloped countries, there's a lot in between. But if we added more categories, basically the computer exploded. So we were pretty limited in terms of adding just 2 categories, which are very crude: high developed and low developed. Obviously that leaves countries like Brazil in a very strange position because they could fall on either side of the line, and and what we found is actually the ERGM is really sensitive. So you changed one little assumption and the entire results were off. So we ran the thing a lot of different times to make sure we had results that made sense and we were happy with mathematically. In terms of levels of development, so to go more qualitatively into the data, which is probably more interesting, less developed countries are typically reliant on a single city. So, you know, if you think of your classic African country with a large commercial capital city, that commercial capital city typically has the vast majority of the firms, especially the multinational firms. You would, if you do see firms located outside of the capital city in an African country, it's either a more developed African country like South Africa, or it's a country that has a particular industry and a particular resource typically. So it may be a mine, it may be a forestry region, it may be it's typically an extractive industry that's located outside the capital city. Then you would find sort of an amalgam of firms located in the capital city, depending on which industry they were in. So if they were services, they may be coming from Europe or North America. If they were extractive or commodity-based services, they would be going the other direction. So in terms of whether they were a firm or a subsidiary. So the other thing with a lot of less developed countries is that there's a lot more government involvement. So and I'm generalizing, but often the laws are such that it has to be a local firm. So the National Forest Extraction Company of Gambia, or the National Coal Extraction Company of Burkina Faso. I'm just making these up, but you get the idea that the country themselves have a vested interest in their development. Oftentimes they'll require that it's a joint venture. In other cases, it'll be an endogenous firm. And the multinational network is sort of very, what I would call, tax optimized. So Indian companies a lot of times will have a Singaporean subsidiary, mostly just so they can do their global business. The business itself has nothing to do with Singapore, but Singapore is a global city where they have, pretty broad currency and financial markets and access to other Asian countries in the world. So it depends on the country and the context, but the qualitative aspects of the network are actually quite interesting. The geography I described in Australia, where I mentioned Sydney and Brisbane and Tamworth, is actually a pretty common one. So typically, I know an Australian firm, and I assume the same is true with a Brazilian or other extractive countries like Canada, you'll have a resource deposit. So, and I mentioned resources a lot because the project was about resources. You'll have a resource deposit somewhere really remote. There'll be a small subsidiary there. There'll be a subsidiary in a larger capital, like a state capital. reports to a larger subsidiary in a big city like Melbourne or Sao Paulo. And then it'll be part of a larger conglomerate that's based in either Singapore or London or Johannesburg or something like that. So there's a lot of sort of nested geographies, and that's where the network makes it interesting, because the network connects the dots.
Okay, thanks for that qualitative and quantitative detail. Was really helpful. Did anyone else have any questions for Thomas? Because I could keep going. Yeah, Aman.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I guess I had a couple of questions in particular about the fifth conclusion that you had around sort of industrial and commercial ties are more important than we traditionally think. And one of those are whether you felt like that was true of particular kinds of cities more so than others, whether there's a geography to that conclusion. And then the second is how you feel like, because at the start, one of the pieces of the literature that you summed up was sort of the firms in general resemble or increasingly resemble financial actors in their operations. And I'm wondering if you could read that conclusion in terms of that general conversation, if there's anything you might want to say about how that impacts that literature or that idea.
Yeah, so I'll do number 2 first, because that sort of addresses what Michael's question was. So this is, I guess, one of the conclusions is that a lot of the connections we observed reflected genuine cross-border activity, like a company in country A wanted to do business in country B, but a lot of it didn't. A lot of it reflected very financialized cross-border activity. So, and that's I think where you really see it. So companies, almost all large companies these days, if not all companies, period, that do cross-border activity are tax optimized, liability optimized. I mean, they're really, really interesting entities. And so the relationships between cities across borders are fundamentally financialized relationships. The devil is in the detail with these things. I can't generalize, because a company that's set up in Singapore and a country that's set up in Dubai and one set up in London are set up for very different reasons. There's also a question of the other side, which is the headquarters locations, which is the listings. Karen could probably talk more about that, but a lot of companies list in London for specific reasons that are tied to the rules of the London Stock Exchange, and so on. But yeah, so in terms of that, you do see a lot of financialization to it. In terms of the first question, again, this is just my qualitative observation, but when you look deep down the list, so you move beyond the Londons and New Yorks, then you move beyond the Stockholms and the Berlins, and then you move beyond you sort of your Dresdens and your Kuala Lumpurs, and you get down to your 500,000, 2,000 city on the list. These are often really small cities. So we're talking about cities in rural Indonesia, in rural India, in rural America, that don't have a lot of firms. These are cities that often have 1 or 2 firms max. And they're if you look at what they are, it's usually pretty obvious, right? They're usually tied to the regional industry, and they're firms that are what I might call dialed into the global financial network. So again, a lot of times it's resources and mining when you get that rural, but it also might be some sort of heavy industry or manufacturing. And so these places, because they only have 1 firm, are extremely reliant on that 1 firm. So that 1 firm provides all the connectivity that 1 city has. I think I looked up when my hometown was on it, or the city closest to my hometown was on it, because they produce airplane parts. There's historically have been an airplane manufacturer. And so retaining that connection to the aviation industry is really critical for the regional economy. Nobody cares about Williamsport, Pennsylvania, but Williamsport, Pennsylvania cares about the aviation industry because it produces all of the good jobs in the region.
Thanks for that, Thomas. We also care about Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. And
ironically, they've
unfortunately,
just cut air service to Williamsport, so there's no longer commercial air service. So the airlines don't care.
No, the airlines definitely don't care. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. We're kind of just running out of time now, and I'm conscious that everyone probably has whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, heading on to kind of your next thing on the hour. So it's the nice thing of chairing is I can just take the opportunity to say once again, thanks Thomas for excellent presentation. Thanks to everyone in the audience for a lively discussion and kind of follow up. There's a couple of links that have been circulated there in the chat. I should take this opportunity at the end of a paper on networks to promote the FinGeo network, the network of networks that is the Financial Geography Network, an upcoming seminar next month, which is a Yuletime special on the 20th of December with Adam Lever from Manchester, which will be great. And then also this recording and previous FinGeo webinars are available on the FinGeo YouTube channel, which has 84 subscribers. So looking to break the 100 maybe this time in the new year. So that'd be great. So just once again, thank you, Thomas, for your talk. Thanks everyone for attending, and I hope you all go on to a lovely day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone, and be sure to tune into Australia versus France in the World Cup.
Oh yeah, of course.
All right, see ya.
Take care.
Thank you, Thomas. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye, thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.